The morning they decided to ban my work truck was the same morning they accidentally started the most expensive argument in the history of our neighborhood. Looking back now, standing where I am today, I almost have to laugh at how ridiculous the whole thing became. Because if somebody had told me a year earlier that a pickup truck would eventually lead to lawyers, land records, angry homeowners, emergency board meetings, and a line of cars stretching half a mile down a county road, I would have thought they were out of their mind. But that's exactly what happened. My name is Ryan Mercer, and for almost 15 years, I've owned a small home repair business just outside of town called Brookhaven Ridge. Nothing glamorous. No giant company. No fancy office. Just me, 2 employees, a truck full of tools, and a reputation I spent years building one customer at a time. The truck wasn't some oversized monster parked on cinder blocks. It was a clean white work truck with my company logo on the doors, a ladder rack on top, and enough miles on it to circle the country several times. Every dent had a story. Every scratch meant a job completed. It paid my mortgage. It paid my daughter's college tuition. It kept food on our table. So when I walked outside one Tuesday morning and found a folded notice taped to my front gate, I honestly thought somebody was playing a joke. Commercial vehicle violation. Immediate compliance required. I remember reading it twice before I even understood what it was saying. Then I read it a third time because it still didn't make sense. Apparently, the Homeowners Association had voted to prohibit visible commercial vehicles inside the neighborhood. No warning, no community discussion, no meeting invitation. Just a piece of paper taped to my gate telling me I had 72 hours to remove my truck or face fines. I stood there in my driveway drinking cold coffee, staring at that notice while my neighbor Carl walked his dog past my house. He looked at me and said, "You get one too?" I held up the paper. "What is this?" Carl laughed. "New board president. Guy thinks he's running the Pentagon." At the time, I didn't think much about that comment. I probably should have. The new HOA president was a retired corporate executive named Victor Holloway. He'd moved into the neighborhood about 3 years earlier and immediately started treating every board meeting like a hostile takeover. People either loved him or couldn't stand him. There wasn't much middle ground. His supporters called him organized. His critics called him power-hungry. I didn't know him personally because I spent most of my time working, not attending HOA meetings. Frankly, I preferred fixing roofs and repairing decks to listening to people argue about mailbox colors. So I tossed the notice on my kitchen counter and went to work. A week passed. Then another letter arrived. This one included a fine. Then a third letter arrived with additional penalties attached. The language became sharper every time. What started as a request slowly turned into a threat. Somewhere along the way, I stopped feeling annoyed and started feeling insulted. Nobody from the board had ever knocked on my door. Nobody had asked about my situation. Nobody cared that the truck was essential to my business. They had simply decided it offended their sense of neighborhood perfection. One Friday afternoon, after finishing a repair job across town, I drove straight to the HOA office. It sat near the neighborhood entrance beside a decorative pond, and one of those giant stone signs developers love to build so people feel like they're entering a luxury resort instead of subdivision. Everything about the place looked carefully managed. Fresh mulch, trimmed hedges, perfect grass. The kind of perfection that exists only because somebody is constantly policing it. Inside, Victor Holloway sat behind a large desk reviewing paperwork. He didn't stand when I walked in, didn't smile, didn't even offer me a chair. He just looked up and said, "Can I help you?" I held up the violation notices. "Yeah, you can explain why my truck suddenly became your problem." He glanced at the papers and immediately knew who I was. "Mr. Mercer, the rules are very clear. The truck's on my property. It's visible from community property." I actually laughed, not because it was funny, because I couldn't believe I was hearing this conversation. So let me get this straight. I own the truck. I own the driveway. I own the house. But somehow you get to decide what sits there. Victor folded his hands. Property values matter. There it was. The phrase every HOA dictator eventually reaches for. Property values. I looked out his office window toward the neighborhood entrance where landscapers were planting flowers around the sign. "You really think my work truck is hurting property values?" He shrugged. Several residents have expressed concerns. Something about the way he said it bothered me. Not angry, not defensive, just dismissive, like the conversation was already over and I simply hadn't realized it yet. That's when I understood this wasn't about rules. It wasn't about aesthetics. It wasn't even about the truck. It was about authority. Victor enjoyed having it, and he expected everyone else to accept it. I left without another word because I knew arguing wouldn't accomplish anything. But that night, sitting alone at my kitchen table while the house was quiet and rain tapped against the windows, I found myself thinking about the neighborhood entrance. Not because of Victor, because of something Carl had mentioned months earlier during a barbecue. A strange story about old property lines and a developer who had rushed construction back in the 90s. At the time, I hadn't paid attention. Now I couldn't stop thinking about it. So I opened my laptop and started searching county records. I had no idea that decision was about to change everything. I wish I could tell you that I immediately found some hidden document and uncovered a giant conspiracy within a few hours, but that's not how any of this happened. The truth is, for the next several weeks, my life became painfully boring. Every evening after work, I'd come home, eat dinner, sit at my kitchen table, and dig through county records until my eyes hurt. Most of what I found was useless. Survey maps from decades ago, old development permits, property transfers between people I'd never heard of, legal descriptions written in a language that somehow managed to make English feel complicated. More than once I almost gave up. There were nights when I'd shut my laptop and tell myself none of this mattered, that I should just park the truck somewhere else and move on with my life. My daughter, Emily, certainly thought so. One evening she stopped by after class and found me buried under a pile of printed documents. She picked up a map and said, "Dad, are you seriously researching the HOA?" I leaned back in my chair. "I'm researching why people suddenly think they can tell me how to live." She laughed. "That's a dangerous hobby." Maybe she was right. But by then it wasn't really about the truck anymore. It was about the feeling that somebody had looked at my life, my work, everything I'd built, and decided it was less important than their personal preferences. That kind of thing sticks with you. A few days later, I finally found something interesting. It wasn't dramatic at first, just a discrepancy. A small inconsistency between two survey maps created almost 20 years apart. Most people would have overlooked it. Honestly, I nearly did. But the more I compared them, the stranger it became. The neighborhood entrance road appeared slightly different in the older records. Not the road itself, but the property underneath it. According to one map, the entrance crossed a narrow strip of land that wasn't included in the original development parcel. I printed the documents and spread them across my table. Then I checked another database. Then another. Every answer created two new questions. A week later, I drove down to the county records office and spent half a day reviewing archive files that hadn't been touched in years. That's where things got interesting. Back in the early 90s, before Brookhaven Ridge existed, the entire area had been farmland. The developer who eventually built the neighborhood purchased most of the surrounding property, but not all of it. One small section had remained under separate ownership. Apparently, the developer had negotiated temporary access rights while construction was underway, intending to finalize the transfer later. Except the final transfer never happened, or at least I couldn't find evidence that it had. At first, I assumed I was misunderstanding something. Large developments don't just forget to purchase the land beneath their main entrance. That would be insane. But every document I reviewed pointed in the same direction. The access agreement existed. The transfer paperwork didn't, which meant somebody had either made a huge mistake decades earlier or the records were incomplete. Either possibility was worth investigating. That's when I hired a real estate attorney named Mark Jensen. Mark was one of those guys who looked permanently unimpressed by everything. I handed him a folder containing weeks of research. He spent several days reviewing it before calling me back. I'll never forget that conversation. "Ryan," he said, "where exactly did you find this?" "County records. You realize if these documents are accurate, this could become very interesting." That wasn't exactly legal terminology, but it got my attention. Over the next month, Mark verified every piece of information independently. He ordered updated surveys, examined title histories, reviewed archived easement agreements, double-checked every assumption I had made. Slowly, the picture became clear. The neighborhood entrance crossed a narrow strip of land approximately 22 feet wide. Not a huge parcel, not something anybody would notice driving over it. But legally it mattered. A lot. The original ownership chain had never been properly extinguished. And somehow, through a series of inheritances, estate transfers, and forgotten paperwork, a partial ownership interest remained connected to my family, specifically my late grandfather's estate. When Mark explained that part, I just stared at him. "You're telling me my family owns the entrance?" He shook his head. "Not exactly. I'm telling you your family appears to have retained rights connected to the land beneath the entrance." "How does nobody notice something like that?" Mark laughed. "Ryan, you'd be amazed how many expensive developments are built on assumptions." That sentence stayed with me. Built on assumptions. Victor Holloway had built his authority on assumptions too. The board assumed residents would comply, assumed nobody would challenge them, assumed they controlled everything inside those decorative stone walls. Meanwhile, they had no idea the ground beneath their most important roadway might not belong to them at all. The next phase took patience. A lot of patience. There was no dramatic confrontation. No secret plan unfolding overnight. We followed the legal process exactly the way it was supposed to be done. Documentation, verification, filings, reviews. Every step completed properly. I wasn't interested in cutting corners because I knew the HOA would scrutinize everything once they discovered what was happening. Months passed. During that time, the violation notices kept arriving. The fines increased. Collection warnings appeared. One letter even threatened legal action. I saved every single one. Sometimes I'd read them and shake my head. If Victor had simply treated me with basic respect during our first conversation, none of this would have happened. But arrogance has a way of making people blind. Then one afternoon, Mark called with the news we'd been waiting for. The ownership issue had been resolved. The necessary interests had been formally transferred. The land rights were now legally secured. I remember sitting in my truck outside a hardware store while he explained everything. Cars moved through the parking lot around me. Customers loaded supplies into their vehicles. It felt like an ordinary day, but it wasn't. Because at that moment, I possessed something Victor and the HOA didn't realize existed. Leverage. For several days, I did absolutely nothing. I went to work, paid my bills, mowed my lawn, parked my truck exactly where it had always been. Part of me wondered whether I should simply leave it alone. After all, I'd already proven my point to myself. But then another certified letter arrived demanding immediate compliance and threatening additional penalties. I opened it in my driveway and actually laughed out loud. The timing couldn't have been better. That evening I called Mark. Hypothetically, I asked, if somebody owned the land beneath a private entrance road, could they restrict access? There was a long pause. Hypothetically. Humor me. Mark sighed. Under certain circumstances, yes. Assuming all applicable laws are followed and appropriate notice requirements are met. Interesting. Ryan. Yeah. What are you planning? I looked across the neighborhood toward the entrance road glowing beneath the streetlights. Nothing dramatic. In hindsight, that may have been the biggest understatement of my entire life. 3 days later, before sunrise on a cool Monday morning, a licensed contractor arrived with a small crew. Everything had been reviewed by attorneys. Every sign had been approved. Every placement had been surveyed. We weren't damaging anything. We weren't destroying property. We were simply exercising rights associated with land ownership. By 6:30 in the morning, the barriers were in place. Clean, professional, legal. Large signs clearly explained that access across the property was temporarily restricted pending resolution of ongoing ownership matters. Then we waited. The first resident arrived around 7. He slowed down, stared at the barriers, and sat there for several seconds trying to process what he was seeing. Then he made a phone call. Within 20 minutes, there were dozens of vehicles lined up. By 8 o'clock, the entire entrance had descended into confusion. People got out of their cars. Neighbors argued. Phones appeared everywhere. Somebody started recording videos. Delivery trucks turned around. Visitors were denied entry. The machine that Victor Holloway had spent years trying to control suddenly ground to a halt. And right around 8:15 that morning, my phone finally rang. The first call came from the HOA property manager, and to be fair, she was still trying to be polite. "Mr. Mercer," she said carefully. There seems to be some confusion regarding the neighborhood entrance. I was sitting on my back porch drinking coffee and watching the sunrise. I'm not confused. There was a pause. Residents are unable to access the community. I know. Another pause. Longer this time. Could we discuss a resolution? I smiled in my coffee cup. Funny how quickly people become interested in discussion when the inconvenience affects them personally. Less than an hour later, Victor Holloway called himself. Gone was the calm executive tone I'd heard in his office months earlier. This version sounded irritated, stressed, and dangerously close to panic. What exactly do you think you're doing? He demanded. I looked out toward my driveway, where my truck sat in its usual spot. Owning property. You're disrupting hundreds of residents. You tried disrupting my business. This is completely different. Is it? Silence. The same kind of silence he gave me the day I sat across from his desk. For the first time since this whole thing started, Victor had no prepared response. Because the problem wasn't emotional anymore. It wasn't political. It wasn't even personal. It was legal. And legal problems don't care who chairs the HOA board. Over the next few days, the pressure became intense. Attorneys got involved almost immediately. Letters were exchanged. Phone calls multiplied. Victor and the board tried every angle imaginable. They argued community necessity. They argued public interest. They argued historical use. My legal team responded with ownership records, surveys, agreements, and documentation. Every conversation eventually reached the same uncomfortable conclusion. The HOA had spent years acting like it controlled the entrance. Acting and owning turned out to be two very different things. Meanwhile, the residents were becoming increasingly frustrated. Ironically, many of them had no issue with me at all. In fact, several homeowners reached out privately after learning the full story. One neighbor named Susan called and said, "Ryan, I don't agree with blocking the entrance, but I also don't understand why they picked a fight over your truck in the first place." That question kept coming up. Why pick this fight? Why escalate something so minor? Why treat a working man's vehicle like a threat to civilization? Eventually, the answer became obvious. Because nobody on the board expected consequences. They had grown accustomed to issuing demands. They had forgotten that authority only works when people willingly accept it. A week in the standoff, everything changed. The board requested a formal meeting. Not a hearing. Not a violation review. A negotiation. Just hearing that word felt surreal. A few months earlier, they wouldn't even offer me a chair. Now, they wanted a settlement. We met at a conference room downtown. Neutral territory. No neighborhood signs. No boardroom power dynamics. Just lawyers, documents, and reality. Victor looked exhausted. The confidence I'd seen during our first meeting had mostly disappeared. To be honest, I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. The board opened with a proposal. They wanted immediate restoration of access. In return, they offered to suspend future fines. Suspend. Not eliminate. Suspend. I actually laughed. My attorney looked at me and smiled because he already knew my answer. We declined. Several hours later, a second offer arrived. Better, but not enough. Then a third. Better still. By the end of the negotiations, the final agreement looked very different from where they started. Every fine related to my truck would be permanently removed. Every violation notice would be withdrawn. Written guarantees would confirm that my work vehicle could remain on my property without future interference. Legal expenses would be reimbursed. Additional compensation would be paid for damages associated with the dispute. Most importantly, the agreement acknowledged something Victor never wanted to admit. The board had overstepped. Nobody said those exact words out loud, of course. Lawyers had edited, but everybody in the room understood what had happened. The signatures were placed on paper. Copies were exchanged. Hands were shaken. Just like that, the war was over. The following morning, the barriers came down. Traffic flowed normally again. Delivery trucks returned. Visitors entered without problems. The neighborhood looked exactly the way it had before, at least on the surface, because underneath, everything felt different. A few days later, I parked my truck in the driveway after finishing a roofing project. The evening sun reflected off the windshield as I carried tools into the garage. For a moment, I stood there looking at it. Same truck, Same driveway, same house. Yet somehow it felt different. Maybe because I had spent months defending something larger than a vehicle. Maybe because I had learned how fragile power can be when it's built on intimidation instead of respect. A week later, I saw Victor for the first time since the 7th. We crossed paths near the neighborhood mailbox cluster. He noticed the truck immediately. There was no way not to. It sat exactly where it always had. For a second, I thought he might say something. Instead, he looked at the truck, looked at me, gave a small nod, and kept walking. No threats, no lectures, no warnings, just silence. And honestly, that silence was worth more than any check they wrote. These days, life is mostly normal again. I still run my repair business. The truck is still parked outside. The neighborhood still has its perfectly landscaped entrance. New families move in. Old disputes fade away. Time does what time always does. But every now and then somebody hears the story and asks whether I regret anything. The answer is complicated. Do I wish things had escalated that far? No, absolutely not. A simple conversation could have prevented everything. Basic respect could have prevented everything. Common sense could have prevented everything. On the other hand, there are moments in life when somebody decides to test how much control they have over you. Most people back down because fighting isn't worth the trouble. Usually they're right. Sometimes they're not. Sometimes the person writing the rules forgets to check who owns the ground beneath them. And that's where I'll leave this story, because even now, years later, people still argue about whether I was justified. Some say I defended my rights. Others say I went too far. Maybe both sides have a point. So I want to hear what you think. If you were in my position, would you have fought back the same way? Or would you have taken a high road and moved on? And if you were one of those residents stuck in traffic that week, who would you blame more, the homeowner who pushed back or the board that started the fight? Let me know down in the comments. I'm genuinely curious where you stand on it. And if you've ever dealt with an HOA, a neighborhood dispute, or somebody who thought authority automatically made them right, share your story too. Don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next one.